In this talk, I want to introduce you to my thinking around how programs of research on inequalities in later life should develop. To do that, I'm going to suggest that we need to revisit some of the concepts that we use for this work to anchor our research more firmly in a causal understanding, and that by doing so, we potentially have greater reach into policy. The starting point for my work, of course, is the dramatic inequalities that we see in later life. Here I have a slide on survival for older women by wealth, and you can see the very marked differences in the slopes of those curves. But we also see differences in relation to all of the other outcomes that we care to consider: employment, pensions, retirement, social detachment, social engagement, and so on. Inequalities are documented according to socioeconomic position, according to gender, to a limited extent, but very profound inequalities in relation to ethnicity, and of course in relation to sexual identity, sexuality, disability, and so on. Part of the argument is that these processes operate across the life course, so that there are critical periods in the life course that will shape future outcomes, but also there's accumulation of disadvantage across the life course. I would like to argue that we also need to pay attention to the transitions that happen later in life. So I give one example here, which is retirement, and showing that people who retire poor have a decline in their mental well-being, while people who retire rich have an improvement in their mental well-being, a transition point in later life that leads to very different outcomes for different groups of the population. The inequalities that we observe, of course, have become increasingly the focus of research agendas set by central bodies such as the ESRC, an example being their inclusive ageing programme, and also a crucial component of policy agendas. But again, my point is that much of this work still rests on description, even if there's a focus on proximal causes. Distal driving fundamental causes are neglected in this work. So I ask the question whether we actually do have the necessary theoretical grounding and the necessary political will in order to achieve change in relation to understand and address inequalities in later life. My starting point in terms of the critique of research is that much of this is what I would describe as epistemologically naive. And I give the example here, which is health research. And of course, health research drives much of this field. And here is a description of epidemiology, the study of the distribution and determinants of disease across the population, where the method is to compare different segments of the population with different risks of disease, and then to look at the dimensions of those segments of the population to see what it is about a particular subgroup of the population that leads to increased risk of disease. And the example given here, of course, is ethnicity. If you take such approach, then the work on these kinds of inequalities in health, in this case, typically focuses on individual risk factors, such as poor employment conditions, as one example, but individual risk factors. The categories under consideration, ethnicity in this case, but could also be gender or class, the ways in which they are constructed and the meanings that they carry are typically not examined. We don't think about how and why ethnicity becomes a point of focus and how and why particular ethnic groups become a point of focus. Instead, the meanings that are constructed and the meanings that are carried by these categories become reified, and they become the source of a centralized explanation. We know what it is to be a member of a particular category. We have a lay understanding of that, and then we use that lay understanding to mobilize explanation. We know what it is to be a Pakistani person. Therefore, that becomes the explanation. I argue that instead we should focus on our understanding on how and why risks are unequally distributed across socioeconomic groups, across ethnic groups, across gender groups, etc. And this requires attention to be paid to the ways in which such risks, as well as institutional responses to them, are shaped by fundamental causal processes, which then require us to change our narrative from a focus on socioeconomic position, on gender and and on ethnicity to a focus on class, racism, and patriarchy. How these processes relate to oppression and exploitation and how they shape life chances. So to focus on fundamental causes. Not a straightforward thing to do. And I personally try to adopt a critical realist approach when I begin to explore my empirical data. So I give an example of how I might do that here. There are other ways, of course. And so the starting point is the concern that empirical research often remains within the world of practice, uses emic and lay constructs to produce explanation as well as description, which then risks the stabilization of these lay categories in both research and political and policy projects, resulting in essentializing and reifying the social relations that are under investigation. We confuse reality with what we perceive to be reality. And as a consequence, our explanation remains rooted in emic constructs. Rather, we need to understand the constructed nature of categories, the constructed nature of the ways in which they are experienced, understood, and acted upon, and then get to explanation by moving from the world of practice to the world of theory, by developing analytical strong constructs that allow for the identification of fundamental causal processes, which means a focus on cause as well as on meaning. And of course, I'm arguing that much of our empirical research really just stays at the level of meaning. So then this requires the adoption of an ontological realist grounding, so that there are real causal processes occurring that result in the generation of power, oppression, and exploitation that we cannot grasp directly, we can only observe indirectly. But we also need to take a stance of epistemological relativism. We are an acknowledgement that both context and the constructed nature of the evidence that we use shapes the findings that we get. So findings are not consistent. We're operating within open systems. And judgmental rationality in order to make sense of the irregularity in the evidence that we have and to reach to fundamental causal explanations. So in this case, as I've argued, ethnicity, gender, and socioeconomic position are not explanatory concepts. They're descriptions. Rather, the associated inequalities are something to be explained, and to do this, we need to reach to underlying causal processes, the operation of power enabled by patriarchy, racism, and class structures. We need to get to real causal mechanisms by observing the perceivable effects of these mechanisms. Not a straightforward thing to do, of course, and I give you one example here in relation to volunteering. So in the top quote, I have a description of a white, early retired, wealthy man who describes how he goes about in a voluntary capacity to raise money by giving talks. And he draws on his cultural and economic capital to do that. He was able to travel to these places that he talks about and engage in those places and stand in front of an audience and talk, because both his economic and his cultural capital, a benign account of a man behaving positively to raise charitable money through his voluntary activity. But he draws very strongly on his identity to be able to do this, a more critical inquiry would suggest. And the ways in which identities, as I give in the quote below, the ways in which identities are perceived, valued, mobilized, and interacted with are shaped by the resources that are associated with those identities: economic, legal, political, symbolic. And important also is how emotions are attached to those resources, emotions that enable us to perform or not perform in particular contexts. So emotions around prestige and value, but also emotions around risk, danger, fear, and disgust that are attached to identities and then constrain and control what we can do. How do we go about doing empirical projects in relation to this? I suggest that to do these kind of empirical projects, then we need to focus on all of macro, micro, and meso areas of oppression and begin to unpick the processes that happen here. So to focus on social structures, on interpersonal interactions, and on institutions. And I illustrate here how social structures shape outcomes, but also contain a cultural dimension, the denigration of others in order to justify the inequality in which they experience. And of course, that denigration then penetrates into interpersonal interactions. It shapes identities and shapes the social encounters that we have with each other, and then results in demeaning interactions, active discrimination, and psychological, physical, and sexual aggression that people with these identities experience. These are forms of violence that emphasize the devalued and fundamental insecure nature of your identity, and then lead to inequalities in both material and health contexts. Core to my argument is that institutions are crucially important in these processes. Institutions become the place where these processes of oppression, of discrimination, of disadvantage become deeply concentrated. This is where the operation of disadvantage becomes amplified, and these are the organizations that shape our lives. And this is partly about rules, processes, and practices, but it's also about how these are enacted by individuals, both consciously as well as subconsciously. We can shape the ways in which institutions operate to a certain extent, and so institutions then are useful targets for our policy work if we understand how the structural and the interpersonal and the institutional interact with each other, and how institutions might be transformed to produce better outcomes. Here I give you an example. The letter on the left is a woman being appointed, getting an appointment letter in the post office, and then if you look at the final paragraph, you see that her appointment in 1961 is entirely contingent on whether a man turns up or not to take her job. We see legislative change and change in employment practice that has transformed these types of experience, produced equality to a certain extent, to a large extent perhaps, within the labour market for women, although there are still important gender pay gaps and slower rates of promotion and so on, but not how it was in the 1960s, a transformation in the last 60 years. But that doesn't mean that gender inequalities are diminishing in substantial ways in other domains of life. And this example from the Fawcett Society illustrates how our actions around the coronavirus pandemic have increased women's risk in the labour market, increased their risk of violence and abuse in the domestic environment, and also within the domestic environment, amplified the expectations on their caring role. We see some changes, but not changes in other areas, which again points to the need to focus on all three arenas. So I'll summarise. I argue that class, racism and patriarchy are fundamental drivers of the inequalities that we observe in later life in relation to socioeconomic position, gender and ethnicity. They operate across the life course, but also operate in later life. We need to understand how they work together, which is what I'm trying to focus on in the next 3 bullet points, but crucially how important institutions are and how the evidence that we have on how institutions amplify these inequalities and mediate these inequalities gives us clues to how they might be addressed and then how institutions might be transformed from places where inequalities are mediated and amplified to places where inequalities may be mitigated and reduced. We need to focus on the functions of institutions and on the transformation of those in a way that pays attention to cause. Thank you.